Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. To the American major, they looked like a mistake that had learned to walk. Major Richard Coleman, West Point class ring on his finger, boots polished like black glass, shoulders squared by a lifetime of inspections, stood on the edge of the Australian compound at Nui Dat and tried not to breathe through his nose. He failed. The air hit him like a slap. Sour sweat, swamp rot, damp canvas, and something else. Something fermented and sharp, like a fish market left out in the sun. He watched 5 men drift between tents and uniforms that had once been green but now looked the color of old bruises. Their sleeves were torn, their webbing was held together with knots, not buckles, and their faces were smeared with mud so unevenly it looked less like camouflage and more like neglect. Coleman's stomach rolled. He wrote a single word in his notebook, the kind of word West Point taught you to use when you needed to keep your disgust professional. Amateurs. He didn't know, couldn't know, that the stench he despised was the first layer of armor that would keep him alive in the next 72 hours. He didn't know that those men, so filthy they made helicopter crewmen gag, were the most efficient predators the Vietnam jungle had ever swallowed and failed to digest. He didn't know he was looking at a philosophy of war so alien to American doctrine that it would later be quietly stolen, renamed, polished, and handed down as if it had been born in the halls of the Pentagon. And he definitely didn't know that, before this week ended, he would watch the multi-billion-dollar US war machine get embarrassed by ordinary fish sauce. So if you think you already understand Vietnam, napalm, Hueys, body counts, big battles, forget it, because this story isn't about firepower, it's about silence, it's about smell, and it's about 5 men who were willing to call death down onto their own heads and trust that it would miss them by a breath. To understand what was brewing in Phuoc Tuy province in March of 1969, you have to understand the American mindset like a religion. The US Army in the 1960s worshipped 3 gods: firepower, mobility, technology. When a patrol made contact, the textbook response was automatic: fall back, mark the grid, call in air support, and erase the problem from the map. Artillery would hammer the coordinates, jets would drop napalm until the tree line turned into a boiling wall of flame. Helicopters would swoop in and out like steel hornets, moving men faster than any enemy could react. On paper, it was beautiful, brutal, clean, efficient. It had worked in Korea against regular armies. It made generals in Washington feel like war could be managed from a distance, like a factory process. Input men and ammunition, output victory. But Vietnam wasn't a factory. It was a jungle that breathed and listened, and the enemy had already read the American manual, then learned how to turn every page into a trap. Viet Cong commanders had a phrase for it, a doctrine whispered through tunnels and tree lines. Grab them by the belt buckle. It meant this: when Americans opened fire, you didn't run away. You ran toward them, you closed the distance until you were so near you could smell their sweat, so near you could see the whites of their eyes. 20 meters, 15, 10. At that range, helicopters and jets became useless. Pilots couldn't drop bombs without killing their own troops. Artillery couldn't fire without gambling on friendly bodies. The Americans' greatest advantage, their ability to turn distant coordinates into craters, collapsed the moment the fight became intimate, and the numbers reflected it, even when the Pentagon tried to bury them beneath phrases like operational success. By the late 1960s, close contact engagements were chewing through American units at a rate commanders weren't trained to accept. Firepower wasn't saving them, it was being neutralized by proximity. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The deepest humiliation was simpler: they couldn't find the enemy. In Phuoc Tuy, the 274th Viet Cong regiment, more than 1,000 hardened fighters, had operated for years like a ghost army. American intelligence knew the regiment existed. They knew its general area. They had names, estimates, even rumors about the commander's habits, and yet patrol after patrol came back with nothing but leech bites, fever, and the hollow stare of men who had walked through green darkness for days and seen no one. Because the jungle was not a backdrop, it was an accomplice. Triple canopy foliage turned noon into dusk. Tunnel networks let entire units vanish underground. Villages stayed silent, out of fear, loyalty, or both. Sensors failed. Trackers got turned around. Dogs sniffed air full of 1,000 living smells and found nothing that mattered. The Americans had brought machines into a place that rewarded instincts, and machines don't understand vines. So someone, somewhere in the free world command chain, made a decision that felt, to American pride, like swallowing broken glass. They called the Australians, not because they respected them, because everything else had failed. The Australian contingent was small, tiny compared to the 500,000 Americans in country, but inside that modest force lived a unit that traveled through rumor like a disease. The Special Air Service Regiment, the SASR. They weren't loud, they weren't flashy, they didn't build myths with press releases, they built myths with statistics nobody liked to repeat out loud. Their patrols went deep behind enemy lines, again and again. They returned with coordinates, layouts, guard schedules, information that made battles tilt. Their casualty ratios were obscene. Where American Special Operations units might achieve something like 10 enemy killed for 1 lost, these men came back with numbers that sounded like lies, and the strangest part wasn't how many they killed, it was how they seemed to see. As if the jungle whispered secrets to them it refused to give anyone else. American command wanted the secret. They assumed it had to be equipment, some new optic, some classified radio trick, some brilliant interception technology, so they sent Major Richard Coleman, West Point trained, sharp as a bayonet, with a simple mission: find out how they do it. He arrived expecting to discover a hidden laboratory in the bush. Instead, he found 5 men rubbing mud on their bodies like they were preparing for a ritual. Coleman's first day at Nuidat began with something he couldn't reconcile with his education. Sergeant Terry O'Brien, the patrol leader, older than he looked and calmer than Coleman thought possible in a war zone, walked his men down a line like an inspector. But he wasn't checking boot shine. He wasn't checking uniform creases. He was checking smell. The Australians had a protocol, a rule so strict it had its own name, spoken like a code phrase among them. Coleman heard the words, scribbled them down, and underlined them with irritation. 3 days out, no Western hygiene, no soap, no shampoo, no deodorant, no shaving cream. That alone felt insane to Coleman. At West Point, cleanliness wasn't just discipline, it was identity. But then it got worse. The men mixed a paste: river mud, crushed rotting leaves, and a generous splash of local fermented fish sauce that smelled like something dead had learned to sweat. They smeared it on exposed skin. They rubbed it into their uniforms. They worked it into fabric until the cloth looked like it had been born in the swamp. Coleman couldn't help himself. A short laugh escaped him, half disbelief, half contempt. O'Brien didn't take offense. He just looked at Coleman as if he'd seen this reaction 100 times, because he had. "Sir," O'Brien said, voice flat, "your men don't just arrive in the jungle." He sniffed the air, not dramatically, just enough to make the point. They announced themselves. Then he listed the announcements one by one, like charges in a courtroom. American-issue soap had a chemical sharpness that didn't exist in nature. American cigarettes burned sweet. Even the sweat of an American soldier, fed on red meat, sugar, dairy, carried a different edge than a man living on rice, fish, greens. To a trained Viet Cong tracker, a U.S. patrol didn't whisper. It screamed on the wind. "Smell is information," O'Brien said, "and they're better at reading it than you are." Coleman wrote it down, but only because it was his job to record what he observed. In the margin, he wrote another word: private, petty, honest nonsense. He was still waiting to find the real secret. He thought: radios, optics, maps. He didn't understand yet that the Australians were stripping away everything that made a modern soldier easy to detect. And the next lesson came from their gear, or rather, from what they didn't bring. Coleman was used to American patrols that looked like walking supply depots: M16S, sidearms, grenades, smoke, claymores, heavy radios, rations, spare ammo, medical kits, 40-50 kilograms per man. Americans didn't travel into the jungle, they invaded it. The Australians looked like they were going on a long, miserable hike. Their rifles were modified, trimmed, almost rude in their simplicity. Their packs were tied with cord, their canteens didn't clink, their gear didn't rattle, even their boots had been cut, slits in the sides. Coleman stared at the boots like they were a violation of sanity. O'Brien explained patiently, like you'd explain something to a man who'd only read about rain. "In this province," he said, "your feet will get wet. That's guaranteed. Waterproof boots just keep the water trapped, then your feet rot. You lose mobility. You die. The slits let water drain." It sounded wrong. It was brilliant. Still, Coleman wasn't convinced. Cheap gear could be romanticized. Bad hygiene could be excused as superstition. Then O'Brien offered him a test, a simple walk. 100 meters, O'Brien said. "You walk like you think you can walk. We'll listen." Coleman agreed, confident. He moved carefully, stepping soft, controlling his breathing, proud of his own discipline. He made it maybe 30 meters before O'Brien raised a hand. "Stop." The Australians, backs turned, began listing what they'd heard, without looking: metal buckle scrape, nylon swish, dog tags tapping, magazine rattle, boot thud, canteen shift, webbing creak. They counted 27 unnatural sounds. 27. In a jungle where silence wasn't empty, it was alive. Those sounds weren't just noise, they were coordinates. O'Brien's voice turned cold. "A sentry can pick that up at 150 meters, he said. Maybe more. And if he hears you, he doesn't panic." He leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "He tracks you. He sets the ambush, and you never know you were dead until the first shot hits." For the first time, the arrogance in Coleman's chest cracked. Not shattered, not broken, but cracked enough to let doubt leak in. These men weren't amateurs. They were professionals playing a game Coleman didn't even know existed. And then O'Brien introduced the most terrifying tool in their kit, a man named Billy Nungarra, an Aboriginal tracker from the Australian interior, quiet, compact, eyes like still water. Coleman had seen trackers before, South Vietnamese scouts, Americans who'd taken a course and learned to spot broken twigs and footprints. This was different. Nungarra moved along a practice trail as if he was listening through his feet. He stopped and pressed his palm to the earth. He sniffed once, barely. Then he spoke, calm, certain. 16 men, he said, moving northwest. 4 hours, 2 heavy loads, 1 limps on the right. Coleman almost laughed again. It sounded like fortune-telling. But when the instructors checked the records, it matched. All of it, even the limp. The Australians didn't call it magic, they called it old. Nungarra's people had survived in harsh country for tens of thousands of years by reading land the way other men read books. The jungle wasn't confusing to him, it was a language. The Viet Cong knew how to hide from machines. They didn't know how to hide from a human being who could feel the past in the ground. Coleman felt something he didn't like: respect. and fear. Because if Nogueira could do that with a training trail, what could he do when the trail belonged to an enemy regiment that had embarrassed the United States for 2 years? 2 days later, theory ended. Orders came down. Patrol Sierra 2, led by O'Brien, would locate the forward base of the 274th Regiment and transmit coordinates for an artillery strike. Coleman expected helicopters, quick insertion, rapid search, rapid extraction, 8 hours in and out like a raid. That's how Americans did it. The Australians unfolded a map and planned the opposite. They would stay out for 10 days. They would infiltrate 40 kilometers deep beyond easy extraction. They would insert far from the target, 20 kilometers away, so the sound of a helicopter would never be connected to their true destination. Coleman stared at the route line like it was a joke someone expected him to admire. 5 men, light rifles, no heavy support weapons, no armored backup, no quick rescue. They were going to walk into the backyard of 1,000 fighters. Coleman voiced what his training demanded. "This isn't reconnaissance," he said. "It's suicide." The squadron commander, tired eyes, sun-browned skin, looked at him with something between pity and boredom. "While you hunt for them," the commander said, "we let them find us." Coleman wrote it down, furious. It sounded like madness. He didn't understand the full sentence yet. It wasn't letting the enemy find them. It was deciding what the enemy would find. The first 3 days were so quiet they felt unreal. O'Brien's patrol moved at a pace that would have driven American commanders insane, barely 3 kilometers a day. They traveled at night, 15 minutes of movement, then an hour frozen, listening. Daytime was spent buried in camouflaged hides, covered in vegetation, breathing slow. Radio contact was minimal, 2 short-coded bursts every 24 hours. They found signs everywhere, old fire pits, cut vines, faint trails marked by sandal tread. The jungle was speaking. On the 4th day, Billy Nogueira stopped so suddenly O'Brien almost bumped into him. He pointed to disturbed earth. Coleman couldn't see anything. Nogueira tapped the mark with a finger, then gestured backward. "Fresh," he whispered. "Less than 6 hours." Then he frowned, a rare crack in his calm. "But wrong." "Wrong?" Nogueira explains in fragments. Someone had walked backward, placing heel first to create the illusion they were moving the opposite way. That wasn't a lost farmer. That wasn't a clumsy soldier. That was a professional tracker, a Viet Cong tracker. And it meant one thing. They were being hunted. Coleman expected retreat, extraction, emergency call. O'Brien did none of it. He gave an order that made Coleman's stomach go cold. "Keep going," O'Brien said, "deeper." Then he gave the second order, the one Coleman would later describe as insanity in his report. "Leave traces, not obvious ones, not traps, just small imperfections, a twig broken a certain way, a leaf scuffed, a patch of grass bent, enough for an expert to notice." They were turning themselves into bait, but not helpless bait. Bait designed to lure a predator into a place where predators died. They were setting a trap that had its own name among the SASR, spoken like a prayer and a threat. The plan was simple, brutal, and required an amount of trust Coleman didn't think soldiers were capable of. Let the Viet Cong track them, draw the pursuing force into a kill zone, then call artillery so close it would feel like the sky was collapsing. The nearest friendly battery was 30 kilometers away. At that distance, American doctrine demanded a safety margin so wide it bordered on comedy. 300 meters minimum. Anything closer was labeled suicide. The Australians didn't ask permission to ignore that doctrine, they simply prepared to do it. Because they weren't counting on American guns. They were counting on the 161st Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, Kiwi gunners with a reputation that sounded like campfire myth. They specialized in danger close fire missions, placing shells where they weren't supposed to be placeable. To survive, 5 men would need to dig deep and trust that a gunner 30 kilometers away wouldn't make a single human error. Coleman couldn't imagine it. He didn't have to imagine for long. On the 5th day, terror arrived on soft feet. The patrol lay motionless in their daylight hides, covered in leaves and mud. Coleman, attached as an observer now, forced to obey O'Brien's pace, could hear insects crawling on the underside of leaves. He could hear his own pulse. Then a Viet Cong scout appeared, not crashing, not stumbling, appearing as if he'd been poured out of shadow. He moved slowly, scanning everything. He stopped, head tilted, listening. Then he drifted closer, closer, closer. He ended less than a meter from O'Brien. Coleman saw the scout's sandal toe near the edge of O'Brien's camouflage, saw the way the Viet Cong soldier's hand hovered near his weapon, lazy, ready. Then the scout sniffed, not once, twice, deep. Coleman's throat tightened. This was it. This was the moment where the Americans' clean world would die. If O'Brien had used soap, if he'd smoked, if he'd eaten something sweet, if he'd carried a chemical scent into this place, they would all be dead in the next heartbeat. The scout sniffed again, searching for foreignness, but the air held only jungle rot, damp earth, and the faint, pungent edge of fermented fish sauce. So common in Vietnam, it blended with life itself. The scout's posture relaxed. He turned away and melted back into the green. Coleman didn't breathe until the jungle swallowed him. O'Brien stayed still for another hour, eyes open, unmoving, letting the fear drain out the way water drained from the slits in their boots. The fish sauce had saved them, but saving them wasn't the end. It was just the proof that the trap could work. By the 6th day, the trap was set. They'd chosen a small defensible rise, an ugly little hill in a sector marked with sterile grid language that felt obscene compared to how alive the jungle was. The Viet Cong tracker had done his job. He'd found them, he'd reported them, and now the response was moving in. Coleman glimpsed shapes through foliage, a reinforced company, more than 100 men spreading out to encircle the hill, 2 platoons forming for a frontal push, a third slipping wide to flank, a machine gun team setting up to sow the hill with fire, 120 against 5. Coleman tasted copper in his mouth. Then the worst possible thing happened. The radio died. Humidity had eaten the contacts, or the battery had failed, or the jungle had simply decided to collect its payment. The patrol's radio operator, hands steady until this moment, went pale. Without artillery, they weren't bait. They were meat. The operator pulled his knife and scraped the battery terminals, praying he wouldn't snap something delicate. He worked like a man defusing a bomb while the bomb ticked in his ear. Outside, the first enemy shots cracked through leaves. Then the radio hissed. Static. A voice. They were back. No time to celebrate. The Viet Cong were already attacking. The enemy commander didn't waste time probing. He wanted to crush the hill before it could bite back. Machine gun fire ripped into vegetation, shredding leaves into confetti. Then a whistle cut through the noise, and gray-clad soldiers surged forward. At 50 meters, the Australians triggered their claymores. The jungle erupted. 20 detonations at once, a wall of steel ball bearings tearing into the first rank. Men dropped like puppets with their strings cut. For a heartbeat, it was a massacre. Then the survivors regrouped, screaming, charging again. 40 meters, 30. Coleman saw faces now, saw eyes wide with fury and certainty, saw grenades arc through the air. O'Brien's men fired until rifle barrels smoked, but there were too many targets and not enough seconds. They were about to be overrun, and then the radio operator shouted into the handset, 2 words that would decide if they lived. Fire mission. Somewhere 30 kilometers south, New Zealand gunners pulled lanyards on 105mm howitzers. The shells began their flight. At that range, the time was roughly 45 seconds. 45 seconds can be longer than a lifetime when men are running at you with grenades. Coleman crouched in a hole so tight his shoulders scraped dirt. He felt O'Brien beside him, calm, almost indifferent, as if he'd already accepted whatever came. The enemy closed within 20 meters. Coleman could hear them breathing. Then the first shell hit. The world didn't just explode, it moved. The ground heaved like an animal trying to throw them off. The sound wasn't heard. It was felt in teeth, in bones, in the soft places behind the eyes. The first salvo landed in a perfect semicircle about 50 meters from their position, close enough that dirt rained into their holes, close enough that the blast pressure punched Coleman in the chest like a fist. For 10 minutes, the Kiwis walked the fire back and forth, churning jungle into splintered stumps and boiling craters. O'Brien shouted adjustments into the radio, cold math in the middle of hell, bringing the wall of death closer, 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 until the explosions felt like they were inside Coleman's skull. Coleman understood then what danger close truly meant. It meant trusting strangers you couldn't see to drop thunder so near it could kill you by accident. It meant choosing the risk of friendly annihilation over the certainty of enemy slaughter. It meant being brave in a way West Point didn't teach. Then as suddenly as it began, the artillery stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the noise. When the smoke thinned, the hill revealed a new world. The jungle that had been thick and green was now a wasteland of shattered wood and steaming craters. Sunlight stabbed down through a canopy that no longer existed. Below, bodies lay where they'd fallen, some still, some twisted, some half covered by dirt thrown up by the blasts. The Viet Cong company that had charged with certainty had ceased to be a company. Later counts would say 73 dead in the kill zone, dozens wounded, scattered, broken, and the Australians? They crawled out of holes like ghosts, shaken, deafened, mud-caked, alive. Only one man had been grazed by shrapnel, nothing that would slow him down for long. Coleman stared at them, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what he'd been taught. This should have been impossible, but it had worked, and the true victory was still ahead. Because the enemy survivors did what wounded animals always do. They ran home. They fled back toward sanctuary, toward tunnels, toward command. And O'Brien's patrol did not celebrate. They reloaded, checked their gear, and followed. For 3 more days, they shadowed the limping remnants through the forbidden heart of the province, using Nogueira's eyes and O'Brien's patience. On the 10th day, O'Brien transmitted coordinates that would change the war in that sector. Not vague guesses, precise locations, command bunkers, anti-air positions, supply depots. The following morning, aircraft struck where O'Brien said they would, and the 274th Regiment's headquarters, so elusive it had mocked American intelligence for years, was torn apart. The regiment didn't disappear forever, but it went quiet. It bled. It stopped moving like a confident predator and started moving like something wounded and hunted. When the extraction helicopter finally thumped down at Nui Dat, Coleman was waiting. The 5 men stumbled off the skids looking like things dragged from a swamp. Their uniforms were rags, their skin was crusted with dried mud and sweat. Their eyes were red from sleeplessness, their faces hollowed by 10 days of listening for death, and the smell, God, the smell, rolled off them in a wave strong enough to make the crew turn away. Coleman didn't turn away. He stood there, notebook still in his pocket, the word amateurs burning like a brand behind his ribs. He walked up to O'Brien. He didn't care about the filth. He didn't care about the stench. He extended his hand. "I was wrong," Coleman said, voice tight. A fool. He expected some sharp reply, some smirk. O'Brien looked at Coleman's clean-pressed uniform, then at his own hand, muddy, stained, smelling of fish and jungle. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, shook Coleman's hand, and walked toward the showers. 3 days later, he would be back out again. Mud, fish sauce, and all. Because this wasn't heroism for applause. It was method. Coleman returned to the United States with a report that read like heresy. He wrote about scent discipline, about silence, about stripping weight, about indigenous tracking that made senses look childish, about danger-close artillery that required trust instead of bureaucracy, about letting the enemy find you on your terms. He recommended study, integration, humility. The report was buried. Officially, it was dismissed as inconsistent with established procedures. Unofficially, it was pride, admitting that a handful of Australians, dirty, ragged, armed with cut-down rifles and fish sauce, understood jungle war better than the most powerful military institution on earth was too bitter a pill for generals to swallow. So the war dragged on. More men died, more money burned, and the lesson set in a dusty file like a loaded weapon no one wanted to touch. Truth, however, has patience. In 1977, 2 years after Saigon fell and the United States stared at the wreckage of its certainty, Colonel Charles Beckwith was tasked with building a new kind of unit, an elite counter-terror force that could do what old doctrine couldn't. The unit would become Delta Force. Beckwith, unlike most men, wasn't in love with tradition. He was in love with what worked. Digging through archives for anything useful, he found a forgotten report. Major Coleman's report. He read it once, then again. Then he understood what it was. A blueprint written in mud. And quietly, without fanfare, without press, without speeches, veterans of the Australian SASR were brought in to teach. Selection courses shifted. Training evolved. Men learned to move like ghosts. Learned to treat smell and sound as weapons. Learned to trust danger close fire. Learned to read environments rather than fight them. The techniques were absorbed, renamed, polished. The origin stayed unspoken, because pride is still a powerful force in uniforms, but the DNA remained. Every time you see modern operators moving through hostile terrain with impossible stealth, every time you hear danger close spoken calmly over a radio, you are seeing the shadow of 5 filthy men in Phuoc Tuy. Years later, long after Vietnam had become a memory wrapped in arguments, Major Coleman, retired now, hair gone gray, certainty worn down by time, traveled to Australia. Officially, he was a tourist. In truth, he carried a debt that had never stopped itching. He found Terry O'Brien living quietly on a cattle station in Queensland, weathered by sun and work, more comfortable with silence than stories. O'Brien didn't talk much about the war, but he let Coleman in. They sat on a veranda with cold beers, listening to the Australian night. Insects, distant wind, the soft sounds of an environment that didn't care about human pride. As the night deepened, Coleman finally asked the question that had followed him for more than a decade. Back in Vietnam, the squadron commander had said something, cryptic, almost dismissive, when Coleman accused them of planning suicide. He'd said, "Let them find you." But there was another phrase too, something O'Brien had once muttered like a rule of life. Coleman called it by the number he'd written down, the code he'd never understood. What did it really mean? Coleman asked. That rule, that philosophy. O'Brien took a long sip, eyes on the dark. "It isn't a trick," O'Brien said finally. "It's acceptance." Coleman waited. "The Americans fought Vietnam like it was a machine problem," O'Brien said. "More engineering, more bombs, more men, more money. Like if you threw enough metal at it, it would behave." He shook his head, slow. "But the jungle isn't a problem to solve," he said. "It's a reality to endure." Coleman felt the old shame rise. Quiet, familiar. O'Brien continued, voice low. "You can't defeat the environment," he said. "You can only survive it. And to survive it, you stop being an invader. You become part of it." He looked at Coleman then, eyes steady. "To become the predator," O'Brien said, "you've got to be willing to live like the prey." Coleman sat with those words and realized something he wished he'd learned at 20 instead of 50. He'd thought war was about forcing your will on the world. Sometimes it was about surrendering your ego to it. Today, decades later, official history books still prefer the clean stories. Big battles, big generals, big American names. They don't carve the names of those 5 Australians onto grand monuments in Washington, but their legacy isn't carved in stone. It's written in training manuals, in whispered lessons, in the habits of men who move quietly in the dark. 5 men, reeking of fish sauce, coated in mud, proved that humility can be deadlier than arrogance. And when Major Coleman called them amateurs, he wasn't looking at disgrace. He was looking at the future of warfare. He just didn't know it yet. Now you do.